Today we have with us Alexander Alex, who goes to Princeton University. He just returned from a research trip to the Galapagos Islands where he was working with the famous scientists Peter and Rosemary Grant. How are you today, Alex?
I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Would you mind explaining to us what exactly it was you were doing on the island?
Of course. The Grants have been traveling to the Galapagos Islands yearly since 1973. On the island, we catch finches, record important measurements about their physical appearances, take blood samples, and then release them back in the wild. We then compare our results to the previous year's data to see what changes have occurred in the finch population on the island.
That sounds rather arduous. What is the purpose of your research?
Well, we're simply trying to track evolution within a certain population of the species in an area.
How would you explain evolution to someone?
Evolution just describes a change in a population over time. Evolution in a population results in changes in the gene pool.
So evolution is a genetically catalyzed process?
Yes. Changes at the level of DNA through mutations usually manifest themselves in populations if the genetic mutation results in some physical characteristic which is beneficial to that organism.
What?
Basically, a change at the genetic level produces a change on the bodily level. If the change is bad, the organism can't survive, can't propagate, and so it dies off. If the change is good, the organism survives, maybe even thrives, propagates, and then generally more members of the population exhibit this beneficial change.
So that's natural selection?
Yes, in a sense, nature itself seems to weed out those that are unfit to survive.
Maybe you could give us some examples.
Sure.
It was a hot day in a deserted location, and he didn't have any water around him outside. So he had a big problem. It's inevitable. Without immediate access to water, he will eventually die of thirst.
If I can get to that water, I can survive. What does I say? Forget it.
If he can't survive, he can't propagate. So his genetic makeup will be eliminated from the gene pool.
Wow, that was really intense. But reading ability controlled by a gene, I think that's just too good of an excuse for youngsters to use whenever they can't read. I'm going to need another example.
Alright, well, we all know that we're each born looking differently. Let's say that we have two young men.
What is this? The tale of Edward Scissorhands and John Henry?
Not quite. Well, let's say that Hammerhand and McScissors live in a world where nuts and shells are abundant, but easily accessible food is scarce. So people who can access the nourishment inside nuts would have the advantage. McScissors can cut the shell open and grab the nut with ease, but Hammerhand can't help but just smash the entire peanut, destroying not just the shell, but the nut as well. So McScissors is more physically fit in this environment. If you want to put it in terms of finch characteristics, these two individuals would have very different beaks, which would give them very different physical abilities. This affects how they get their food.
I see. So he would survive successfully and then propagate and produce more like him?
Yes. In this case, McScissors would also benefit from sexual selection. Since he is able to eat more food, he looks more fit than Hammerhead, who is only left with measly scraps. The female mates would choose McScissors, as his physical appearance and ability to provide suggests that his DNA will lead to a better chance of survival in such a world.
What an interesting example.
Thanks, Jane. But I think I have some examples that would really clear up any misconceptions that the student population of UTD has over evolution.
Oh, really?
Yes, I've only been here for a few hours, but I've already noticed that there's a serious lack of Greek life.
Haven't you heard? We're a nerd school. All the frat guys go to SMU.
Well, in this population, a frat guy would be unlikely to survive.
In fact, we got some interesting footage recently. He's a frat guy, so he doesn't know any of the right answers in class.
That's correct. Who can tell me the name of the enzyme used in the first step? Mr. Jacobs?
DNA?
That is wrong.
Chill, bro. Stupid frat boy, you'll never make it at this university.
Since he's getting beaten up, he will not be able to propagate and contribute his genes to the gene pool. The frat kid must adapt, somehow trick the environment around him, and then get away. For the time being, this is his only way to survive.
Hey, did you see a frat boy run past here?
Yeah, I think he went down the elevator.
The elevator. Thanks.
He might come back when the environment changed enough where his
He's
innate
gone.
differences could not be perceived as strengths.
I don't think that's going to happen. Greek life is just not the trend here. Geek life is.
Well, I hear UTD is expanding at a pretty explosive pace. As it grows bigger, Greek life is probably going to become more popular. If the Greek population exceeds the nerd population, then the nerds will no longer be the most fit to survive in such an environment.
So they'll be weeded out.
Exactly, either naturally or sexually.
Seriously?
Yes, we even have a scientific simulation prepared using predictions based on current trends.
Let's say he went away for 3 years, and over these 3 years, the Greek population grew and grew.
Whoa, what's going on? Where's my kin lab? What happened? Where did all the nerds go?
Where have you been for the past 3 years? This isn't a nerd school anymore. This is a party school. Woo!
Hey, you ready to go?
Sure. Wow, what a thought. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for coming in today and explaining to us the basics of evolution. Do you have any overlaying message that maybe you want to leave us with?
Yeah, evolution is a constant process. It is happening all the time, all around us, even now. As the human population keeps on growing, we keep on getting new genetic combinations in the human gene. And some of these combinations might prove more advantageous than others. Only time will tell.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you so much for watching us today on the Jane Smith Show. Have a good day.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Jane Smith Show today on UTD-TV. Today we have with us Jimmy Stevens, who is a friend of Alex Alexander, who was on the Evolution show last week. And Jimmy came in to answer some of the questions that were sent in to me through email. So Jimmy, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Alex sent this necklace down. It's got some feathers from the finches on the Galapagos Islands.
Oh my gosh, wow, would you look at, thank you, it's
Yeah,
so
you're welcome.
gorgeous, thank you. Well, I hope you're excited to be here because we have a lot of good questions for you.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So, what's the first question?
The first question is from Creationism is True 99. They said, evolution is complete nonsense. There is no chance that we could share common ancestry with apes. Apes are animals and thus soulless. They have no chance of salvation in heaven. Additionally, all organisms on this earth, both plants and animals, have such intricate anatomy and physiology as to suggest intelligent design. There is simply no way these things could have spontaneously arranged themselves and evolved into hundreds of different species. How can you deny the presence of a thoughtful creator whenever you break open a pomegranate or gaze into the eyes of a hopeful child? Darwin and his followers preach folly, and the mere thought of natural selection is simply too implausible to process. Whew.
That's a really long question.
Yeah, it sure was, Jimmy. But we got several emails endorsing the creationist view, and this particular person, had several points. How would you address them?
Well, creationism is always a hard school to address as far as evolution goes. But unfortunately, we are scientists, and being scientists, we're taught to go on what we can see in the natural world, what we can see from scientific and empirical evidence. And unfortunately, there's no evidence for creationism that we've seen so far. Now, we can show them the fossil record, but that's not always going to get it done. That's not always going to shake them in their faith, because they're based in faith. We look through a scientific lens, and they look through a faith-based lens. And in faith, you just have to accept things. So in the end, we can say they're wrong, they can say we're wrong.
Oh, wow. Also, aren't there some certain structures, like in whales and humans, that are analogous?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. In whales, the flippers have long bones, kind of like our fingers. Then you look at a batwing, completely different creature, but again, long bones, kind of like fingers. And then you see our hands, if you look at our skeleton, again, the same structure, long bones.
Oh, that's neat. Hey, you mentioned the fossil record. We got another email asking about it. It says, how can you be so sure of the evolutionary process when there are so many gaps in the fossil record?
Well, that's a good question as well, and we do have an explanation for that actually. See, over time, bones get old and they wither away, whether it's, they've been exposed or they just crumble to dust. So by the time we get to that area, on a dig or something else, the bones are gone. We lose that information that they could have given us. Also, there is a theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. Normally, people think of evolution as gradually changing. You look at an animal 500 years later, and you see these changes, but if you look at it, 10, 15 years after it started evolving, you can't tell anything. Punctuated equilibrium is different, however. You have certain events that will suddenly cut off a certain trait in a species, and then you'll just have the rest of the species left over, and they'll completely just flood the gene pool with their traits only, and the trait that you've lost is gone for good. And that's what we call punctuated equilibrium. That accounts for the gaps in the fossil record, because it's a very quick event, only 50, 60 years.
Wow. Another email we got was from Princess Kylie012. She wrote, evolution is too slow of a process to see at once. Thus, how can we accept this theory?
That's actually what Darwin thought at first as well, but the research we've done with the grants, me and Alex, or Alex and I, has shown that through the finch's beaks that we've measured, this actually is a very measurable process. For example, the grants one year, there was a drought, and this drought killed off a lot of the plants on the islands, and so these plants couldn't produce seeds. So birds with beaks, smaller beaks that were adapted to eating seeds, died out. While the birds with bigger beaks who were adapted to eating nuts, which were not scarce, lived on, and so we saw an increase in birds with big beaks the next year. Then a few years later, there was a lot of rain, and this completely washed away a lot of the nuts, but left a lot of seeds because there was a lot more plants. So birds with smaller beaks had a larger food source, while the birds with bigger beaks died off, and you saw smaller beaks later on. So evolution had basically cycled back to smaller beaks.
Wow, that's really neat. Well, Jimmy, that's all the time we have for today, but do you have any closing remarks on the evolution discussion?
Well, I just want to say that whether or not you believe in evolution, there are certain changes that are occurring within individuals and organisms over periods of time. And these changes add up, and this becomes evolution, in a word. You end up with something completely different from what you originally started with. For example, you take a cake, and it's liquid batter, you can mix it up with your spoon, your whisk, whatever. And then you stick it in the oven. And in the oven, the ingredients all mesh together and they slowly change until you get a solid cake. Moist and delicious, yes, but solid nonetheless.
Wow, that's some food for thought. Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, and thank you so much for watching the Jane Smith Show on UTD-TV.